great deal of confidence yesterday, a good deal of anxiety today. One woman at the telex office of our hotel held my arm this evening and said, "Do you think we'll make it?" And I really couldn't answer this evening on the basis of what we've seen, with a great deal of confidence that they would. However, Romanians as a whole are so fiercely angry at what has transpired here over the past 24 years that it seems impossible to me that they will look back on the road that they've decided to take, which is one of total and absolute refusal to tolerate Ceausescu and an authoritarian communist regime one day longer.
NBC News correspondent Arthur Kent in the middle of all of that in Bucharest on the telephone from Romania this evening. And an idea of the confusion, the sheer utter confusion that reigns in this revolution can be seen in fighting at the Bucharest airport. Another NBC correspondent flew right into it. His report and today's news from Panama as we continue.
How about these medical school doctors?
And this is what he found.
The armed men defending Bucharest airport were drawn from border police, the regular army, and a people's militia. They wore thin armbands to recognize each other. They were up against an unknown number of secret police, determined to prevent the revolution for democracy. The first attack came from nowhere. The airport perimeter had been breached. No one knew the strength of the probe. When dawn broke, the motley band defending the airport saw they had beaten off a major assault. They still didn't know if the first wave was over. The relief at having survived and not run was obvious to the young soldiers. Then tanks moved up. No one knew for sure whose side they were on. They flew revolutionary colors from their antennae. Their crews stayed inside, battened down under armored hatches. Police vehicles were also outside, flying no colors at all. The airport defenders carried away their dead. Slain attackers stayed where they had been cut down. 16 attackers were taken alive and led away. Their fate was unclear. 2 officers from the attacking force were being held inside an airport terminal restroom. The militiamen referred to them as pro-Ceausescu terrorists. We weren't told what was planned for them either. It was time to get the wounded to a nearby hospital, then to reload and regroup.
The uncertainty now is about which units of the security forces are still opposed to the army and the new provisional government.
A Romanian Air Force jet appeared from nowhere. All sides tried to bring it down. That started another firefight. All were now unsure about who their real enemies were or exactly where they were. As the light faded, the airport defenders were pulling back from their forward positions to the terminal itself. They were preparing to fight to the end. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Bucharest.
As we reported earlier, Nicolae Ceausescu, his wife, and other family members have been captured. They are being held by the army and will be put on trial, but that has not broken the resistance of those who still support them. The news from Panama.
The new regime announced on television today that Ceausescu and his family have been arrested and will stand trial. But the bloodshed continues as pro-democracy troops battle security forces still loyal to Ceausescu. In the streets of Bucharest and other cities, bands of citizens armed with knives and clubs are joining army troops to resist the dreaded and well-equipped secret police. According to some reports, the death toll is at least 5,000 and could go much higher. Dennis Trout reports from Romania on the day's events.
Serious fighting begins in the early morning, a staccato of machine gun bursts punctuated by cannon fire. Street by street in some neighborhoods, the army is trying to clear areas infested by the security forces still loyal to deposed dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. The National Museum is set ablaze in the fighting. The television station comes under siege, and the security forces surround and close the country's major airport.
The fear, of course, is that security forces are trying to retake the airport from the army.
But their attack at the airport and other outlying areas may also be simply a feint, so they can mass for a major counteroffensive in the center of Bucharest. The noose around the airport has been tightening for nearly 24 hours.
We was very, very frightened. Very frightened.
The security forces tried to run through the army's defenses in a bus, which was stopped by machine gun fire. The fighting at one point reached to the terminal's front door. During lulls, the army hauled away its casualties. Romanians stranded in the airport combat zone tried to rally their spirits with shouts against the former dictator and with applause for the army, which has joined the people and its new democratic movement. The National Salvation Government announced that Ceausescu had been captured at last, but that could not be proven, and the brutal fight staged by his loyalists continued. The security men are outnumbered in some areas, so there were groups which surrendered. This sniper fell into the hands of an angry crowd and disappeared just as a single shot was fired. But the well-equipped security forces are reported to be holding some towns and sections of others. A massacre of an entire village.
In that country, they held a candlelight vigil at Pioneer Courthouse Square, where they sang hymns for the dead, along with Christmas carols. Among those praying for peace was a former lieutenant in the Romanian Navy who defected to the United States 10 years ago. He says Romanians oppose outside help while the gunfire continues there.
I don't know what is the United States policy or what they think they should do, but Romania do not need any intervention from any other country, not from United States, not from Russia, not from other Warsaw-backed nations, absolutely none.
Jim Hyde now has an update on today's fighting in Romania.
Peace on earth does not apply to Romania on this Christmas Eve. Battles for control of Bucharest continue. Army units that turned against President Nicolae Ceausescu on Friday, allied with civilians, are holding key parts of the capital. But fierce fighting rages there and in the western city of Timișoara, where 4 Western journalists were wounded today while covering the battle. Spokesmen for the new government claim to have captured the dictator who ruled Romania for 24 years, but Ceausescu has not been seen in public. Revolutionary soldiers have found a vast labyrinth of tunnels and safe houses used by secret police who supported his rule. Food and medical aid for Romania are being prepared by the Red Cross, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but the fighting is preventing delivery. The Soviets are sending mixed signals about possible military intervention on the side of the new government. Secretary of State James Baker says the U.S. would not oppose such a move.
I think we would support efforts to assist the Popular Front for National Salvation there in Romania.
The French government has offered to muster a brigade of volunteers to help the insurgents. People in Romania who have suffered religious persecution are now able to play Christmas music in public for the first time in 42 years. Jim Hyde, Channel 2 News.
Meantime, the wife of U.S. Ambassador Alan Punch Green is in Bulgaria tonight. Joan Green led a convoy of Westerners out of the country today. The embassy staff is being reduced to minimum levels. Ambassador Green himself remained in the embassy. A home in southwest Portland was destroyed by fire tonight.
But other top officials are ruling out any plans to send Soviet troops to Romania. Rick Inderfirth has the story from Moscow.
At today's session of the Congress of People's Deputies, Mikhail Gorbachev said the Soviet Union had contacted its Warsaw Pact allies with the aim of providing support to the Romanian people. He said the first planes with medical supplies had already arrived in Bucharest. He also said that a number of other measures were being worked out with the Warsaw Pact, although they apparently do not include military aid. Earlier today, Romanian TV reported that the Soviet embassy had pledged personnel and equipment to help the anti-Ceausescu forces, assistance that would have to be brought in since Soviet troops are not stationed in Romania. But that was virtually ruled out later today in Moscow by Soviet Prime Minister Ryzhkov, who said, to bring in military forces would be impermissible. We must not repeat mistakes. And tonight on Soviet television, there was extensive coverage of the uprising in Romania, calling attention not only to the repudiation of ousted Communist Party chief Ceausescu, but the debt of gratitude many Romanians feel to Mikhail Gorbachev and his reform program of perestroika that has brought about such sweeping changes in Eastern Europe. Rick Inderfirth, ABC News, Moscow.
In Washington, a 24-hour task force has been set up to monitor events in Romania. The U.S. has welcomed Ceausescu's demise, but so far the American reaction has been muted. David ENSOR is standing by at the State Department with details.
Carol, a written statement issued by the State Department this evening says that the United States supports the new government of Romania and its commitment to democratic reforms. The statement notes that the new government is besieged by what it calls outlaw members of the secret police still loyal to the dictator Ceausescu. It calls on them to lay down their arms. The statement says the U.S. has already offered humanitarian assistance to the new Romanian government and is looking for ways to supply more emergency medical assistance, which of course is so urgently needed now in Bucharest. The statement also notes that the United States has been in contact with the Soviet Union about the situation in Romania. Carol?
Thank you, David. Reaction elsewhere in the country to the downfall of the Ceausescu government has been positive, at least in one case. In Detroit today, more than 150 Romanian Americans demonstrated on the steps of the federal court building in support of the pro-democracy movement, which ousted the Romanian leader. Elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, all of Czechoslovakia's political parties have met and nominated Václav Havel for president of the country and Alexander Dubček for chairman of the parliament. Havel is the dissident poet who emerged as leader of the opposition to communist rule, and Dubček was
killed here alone. Many more are injured. Over 30 pro-Ceausescu prisoners are now being held in the airport complex. On the airfield itself, the distant runways are blocked with civilian trucks. And what used to be President Ceausescu's private 707 lies idle on the tarmac. Sources say the former dictator's in hiding, his son's arrested. Anti-Ceausescu forces are pinning their hopes on unconfirmed reports that the Soviet troops may well land at the airport to lend assistance in their fight against the dictator's forces. Many of them say they're already running desperately short of ammunition against increased incoming attacks.
Here at Bucharest Airport, a fierce gun battle has now been going on more or less continuously for several hours between the army and forces still loyal to the Ceausescu regime. They've been using tanks, heavy artillery and machine gun. The dead and injured are still being brought into the main terminal building.
TV screens played martial music. The fighting continued for more than 18 hours, with over 300 civilians huddled for safety in the center of the terminal building. In the cold light of dawn, the tanks became visible, bearing the flag of an army now supporting civilians against Ceausescu. They were joined by militiamen and even civilians armed with obsolete rifles. As Romanians kill Romanians, the years of oppression end in agony. Alex Thompson at Bucharest Airport.
Give rest, O Lord, to your departed servants, in a place of refreshing light and rest.
This is a special service tonight at St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Church in southwest Portland. There were about 50 in the congregation praying for loved ones in Romania. All week, Romanians in Portland have held special prayer services at their churches and public vigils for peace in their homeland and the safety of friends and relatives. With fresh U.S. troops now in Panama, the Pentagon says...
Grim sight, the bodies of civilians who were massacred at Ceausescu's orders, unearthed from the mass graves where they had been hastily buried. The people here said that the bodies had been bundled with wire and tossed into holes. Many of the victims tortured and mutilated before they died. Hundreds of anxious, grieving Romanians have come here trying to identify the bodies of relatives. It is too much for many to bear. And as the extent of the slaughter strikes home, the hatred of Ceausescu rises.
He's an oppressor, a tyrant. I think he is, as Stalin and Hitler, he is worse than that. Because if we think about Hitler, his people were shooting at other peoples, but our people to shoot our people.
The search for people connected with Ceausescu has taken an ugly turn. Mobs round up anyone suspected of being a sympathizer, often without proof. The anger is mixed with joy as people relish the prospect of a free Romania. But these changes have come at a high price for Romania. This Timișoara man, speaking German, who came to the mass grave, said all these people wanted was freedom.
That was George Lewis reporting. Since his capture, Ceausescu still hasn't been shown on Romanian television. His captors say that's to prevent any rescue attempts by his followers.
Raised, and so the British ambassador is now our guest, I understand. And so that has been a very traumatic pre-Christmas uprising. That's still going on, incidentally, but a little more control of the armed forces against the others. I really have to go. I really have to run. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. Same to you. Coming home a little right now.
President Bush, as he spoke just a few moments ago in the Pentagon parking lot where the helipad is, he's going to his helicopter there just about 8 or 9 minutes ago, reporting on the latest from Panama and from Romania. The president reporting that while General Noriega has not been captured yet, things look much better from the standpoint of restoring some of the order in Panama City and elsewhere in the country. He mentioned that Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, will be there. That is a reference to the fact that Secretary demolished to some extent in Bucharest. That's the first we've heard of that here. And he said the British ambassador is now the guest of the United States in the U.S. Embassy, so presumably he's all right, but no further report on what's happened. The fighting continues to some extent in Romania. The situation there has not been resolved. We'll have details of these and other stories tonight on World News Sunday over most of these ABC stations. I'm Sam Donaldson in Washington. Good afternoon. To be the inevitable, and I think he gets a lot of credit for that. I think he was the man of the decade.
I don't give a man a great deal of credit for not committing massacres.
Well, if your predecessors have done that and killed millions and millions, I think you get some. And the second man of the decade clearly was Ronald Reagan. Although I think he was to a large extent reactive. He did a lot which helped bring us to this point. For good or evil,
Are we
as
allowed
time
to choose
says.
a force of the decade rather than a person of the decade? Because it was clearly in the direction of change towards the end. And I'm concerned that our country isn't changing and isn't going through a period where they're going to be able to cope with a lot of what's been called new thinking as quickly.
Well,
the number of heroes, the Hungarians were the first to let people pass through and leave the East Bloc and go into the West. And I thought they did heroic work. So did Lech Walesa. So did many others.
And the news has been so fast.
A promotional fee has been paid to ABC by United Airlines, rededicated to giving you the service you deserve. Come fly the friendly skies.
This is ABC.
Up next on Channel 2 News, former night, revolutionary authorities executed the pair today for what were termed grave crimes. Meanwhile, Portland-based medical group is getting ready to travel to Romania at the request of the U.S. State Department. As Bob High reports, Northwest Medical Teams hopes to make the trip soon, even though the fighting is far from over.
Gunfire erupted again in Romania following Christmas Day celebrations. Army troops sealed off areas of Romania's capital city, Bucharest, organizing a building-by-building search for snipers loyal to the Ceausescu regime. The 71-year-old Ceausescu and his wife Elena, who served as second in command, were executed Monday by firing squad after a secret military trial. A Pacific University political science professor believes Ceausescu's execution is aimed at breaking resistance from loyalist security troops.
He's being killed. It takes away from them this any kind of hope that they could change it. So it means it is some inducement for them to surrender.
Portland's Northwest Medical Teams, which organized a medical relief effort for earthquake victims in Soviet Armenia, has been contacted by the State Department to prepare for a similar trip to Romania. Executive Director Ron Post is hoping for help, especially from the local Romanian community.
We right now do not know of any Romanian-speaking people in our files, so if there are people available that are medical and speak Romanian, we certainly would like to hear from them.
Northwest Medical Teams is also collecting donations to add to relief already being delivered by the Red Cross. You can contact Northwest Medical Teams during regular business hours at 624-0229. Bob High, Channel 2 News.
And there's word that a right-hand
crimes against Romania. At TV Romania, which is both the voice of the revolution and its command post, some workers cried for joy.
After 40 years, you can't understand that.
The U.S. today expressed regret that the deposed leader had not been tried in public, but also established diplomatic ties with the provisional government.
Pope John Paul II.
Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were executed, convicted today of killing 60,000 Romanians.
Sentința a rămas definitivă și a fost
The announcement was made on Romanian television, and the reaction was immediate in that country. There was cheering in the streets.
Happy, and I am emotional that I know that it will be true. Okay.
The Ceausescu's ruled this country with an iron fist. The revolution against them has led to wide-scale fighting and thousands killed. Medical supplies and volunteers from throughout the world are coming into Romania now to help out. And amidst the turmoil, church services celebrating Christmas today. For the first time in years, Christmas symbols were evident in public in Romania. And the latest word from Romania is that the U.S. ambassador, Portlander Punch Green, is in good shape. He's safe. He is living at the embassy in Bucharest. Green's wife led a contingent of Americans out of Bucharest yesterday. They headed first to Bulgaria and then on to Frankfurt, West Germany.
Will the execution today of Nicolae Ceausescu finally end the bloodiest of this season's upheavals in Eastern Europe? John Donovan reports tonight from Bucharest.
This is how workers in one Bucharest hotel reacted when Romanian television announced Ceausescu's death. The broadcast said Ceausescu had been tried on 6 counts and, together with his wife, had been executed by firing squad. 2 deaths that most Romanians treated like a Christmas present. It was only 4 days ago that Ceausescu stood on this balcony in downtown Bucharest and heard himself cheered by the people. The last time they allowed themselves to be used in his fantasy that he was a beloved president. But if Ceausescu's era is over, what will follow now is still far from clear. On this Christmas Day, Romanians made the best of the holiday. It was the first time since the start of communist rule, the first time in more than 40 years, that Christmas could be celebrated this openly. But the streets of the city are not safe. Romania remains in a state of civil war. The uniformed army has decided to back the revolution that overthrew Ceausescu, but some members of his secret police force are waging guerrilla battles against the population, here and in other towns. The fighting is light during the day. It is at night when it's hard to see that the gunfire heats up, and it becomes difficult to sleep. No one knows how many secret police they're fighting, whether it's hundreds of them or thousands. In theory, there is a new government made up of artists, military men, and politicians who promise the people on television that a new constitution is being prepared. But mostly there is disorganization. The streets not ruled by the army have been taken over by young men, stopping cars and passers-by in a search for secret police agents. These are people who have contained their anger at Ceausescu for years and who are for the first time experiencing a sense of their own power. They seem to relish the feeling. But they are also suffering. Romania is the only Eastern European nation this year to have failed at peaceful revolution, the only one to have spilled blood, the blood probably of thousands. And on this Christmas, thousands are simply praying and wondering when next they can sleep through a silent night. John Donovan for Nightline in Bucharest.
And finally, some unalloyed good news. This Christmas, an Iron Curtain is rising across Eastern Europe, a remarkable event that was celebrated this Christmas with a performance conducted by Leonard Bernstein at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in East Berlin. Yes, East Berlin, where they sang not the Ode to Joy, but the Ode to Freedom. We presented, courtesy of station KCET Los Angeles, along with the names of those members of Nightline staff whose faces you do not see, whose names you probably do not know, who do nothing all year except get this show on the air. As Dickens might have put it, God bless them, everyone.
Some fighting continues, but the new government hopes the pictures of Ceausescu's execution will prompt the dictator's secret forces to surrender.
And the new government of Romania officially received U.S. diplomatic recognition today, delivered by the American ambassador Alan Punch Green. Green left his home in Portland less than a month ago to assume the post in Bucharest. This morning, he presented the message in person from President Bush to the new deputy prime minister. Later, the ambassador talked with Northwest medical teams and Channel 2 News by telephone. Green says the fighting has eased and the gunfire is only sporadic.
I walked around town for the first time they let me. I went out with 2 security guards. The students have formed around, and there's a lot of candles lit for the people, for the very brave Romanians who died.
Ambassador Green says he is still unable to return to the American embassy near the airport in Bucharest, which has been the scene of some of the heaviest fighting. Mrs. Green, other American dependents, and staff left Bucharest by automobile caravan and arrived safely in West Germany last week. And as the fighting appears to be decreasing in Romania, medical supplies are beginning to reach the wounded. Shipments from the Soviet Union and France have arrived, and the U.S. State Department has asked the Northwest Medical Team from Portland to assess the needs in Romania. And Jim Hyde reports the team may leave as soon as tomorrow.
The Northwest medical teams have responded generously before to pleas for help from Mexico City, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. That's why anxious Romanian emigres came to the offices of the volunteer organization in Tigard. And the U.S. State Department has asked the team to learn firsthand about specific medical help in Romania.
They'll go possibly as early as tomorrow to assess the needs as to what long-range help is needed in Romania. At this time, we've been told by the ambassador that medical personnel at the moment may not be needed.
Team leaders talked to Ambassador Punch Green in Bucharest by telephone. He relayed the request of the new government there, voiced by the Deputy Prime Minister. No foreign doctors and nurses yet, but all kinds of medical supplies are needed.
Surgical packs, scalpels, bandages, intraoperative medications, both antibiotics and otherwise. Probably blankets. We could use IV solutions and fluids.
Northwest medical teams have a small amount of such material on hand, but much more will be needed, from sterile syringes to blood transfusion kits. The volunteers are asking for donations of supplies from medical and pharmaceutical companies and cash to purchase more. Timing is critical.
What we would like to achieve is expedite everything. They need all the supplies right away. So a delay of one day might mean dozens or hundreds of lives we can save. So I urge everybody who is in charge to cut all the red tape and just let it go.
A Romanian Airlines cargo plane is being ready to pick up the material collected in several U.S. cities. In Tigard, Jim Hyde, Channel 2 News.
In Panama today, Romanian television after being executed by a firing squad. The Ceausescus are believed to be responsible for the deaths of 60,000 people during their reign. Here in Oregon, the Northwest Medical Team plans to leave on a fact-finding trip to determine exactly what kind of medical help Romania now needs.
Fate of deposed leader Ceausescu, photographs of Ceausescu on trial, and his body after he and his wife were executed by firing squad. As fierce civil war apparently tapered off somewhat today, the first stress cracks appeared in the new Romanian provisional government and signs of more turmoil and possible violence to come. Bob Simon is on the scene.
He was defiant to the end. The trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, broadcast on Romanian television tonight, revealed the captured leader and his wife Elena refusing to recognize the court which was accusing them of crimes against the people. Minutes later, they were dead, executed by a firing squad at an undisclosed location.
In Bucharest today, people said it was unfortunate that the man who called himself the greatest Romanian in history could die only once, and so quickly.
They all say he died too much easier. He should have been punished much more terribly.
His legacy was being dealt with outside Bucharest today. A new cemetery was under construction. The old one did not have room for 3,000 fresh graves for the victims of Ceausescu's last massacre. Children and old people, but students mainly. Students who demonstrated at Bucharest University last Saturday when Ceausescu called in the guns. New heroes, new leaders. The new government of Romania was displayed on television today. The president, Ion Ionescu, credentials, a senior communist who'd been demoted by Ceausescu and who was a friend of Gorbachev. He promised free elections in April. The tanks were still in the streets today, and there were other signs of extraordinary times, like food, more variety in more stores than people could remember, and newspapers with names like Spark of the People, Truth, Liberty. New first editions coming out every day in such demand that self-appointed town criers read them out loud to crowds. Real reprisals have not begun yet, but the old guard is being rounded up.
Familiar faces spotted by people who'd been imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured. Ceausescu's poet laureate sought refuge at the American embassy, but was pulled away by an angry crowd.
And more anger is coming to the surface. The people of Romania took the extraordinary step of killing their old leader, and many are saying that the new leaders they saw on television today wear too many of the same Stalinist stripes. The Romanian Revolution may have just begun. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
President Bush announced a $500,000 emergency aid package for Romania today, mostly medical supplies to be distributed through the International Red Cross. Additional U.S. aid is said to be in the works.
A tale of horror is emerging about the despotic reign of Nicolae Ceausescu. So hated were Ceausescu and his wife Elena that the firing squad that executed them had to be chosen by lottery because of the many volunteers. Romania's new government today defended the speedy execution, saying it feared Ceausescu's secret police might try to free him. NBC's Arthur Kent reports from Bucharest.
He'll see in the new year in his grave, the people chant, upon hearing reports of their former dictator's execution. Most Romanians today had no doubt how Nicolae Ceausescu will be remembered.
As a black spot, something, a dark period, something awful that stopped us and made us like slaves only for him.
Romanian television broadcast again today pictures of Ceausescu and his wife Elena being judged by a special military tribunal. Found guilty, the announcer says, of crimes including genocide against the Romanian people.
That's why the people is still fighting in the streets, and they will fight until the destruction of this band of traitors of the country who joined with foreign forces to organize this coup d'etat.
Ceausescu scoffed in disgust at the death sentence. "We do not recognize you as a court," he said.
I will not answer these questions because I will not answer. And no one fired against the people in the Palace Square in Bucharest.
His wife said, "How can you do this? I was like a mother to you." But today, this image of the man once known as the tyrant. He and his wife, say Romanian TV, were shot to death yesterday afternoon. The dictator's legacy was violence, firefights sparked by his Securitate gunmen. Today was the first day people could safely return to where so many fell. This woman said she had watched last week as 4 students were shot dead before her by Securitate snipers. Grief turned to anger in this crowd in Bucharest today when a Securitate agent fell into their hands. There are unconfirmed reports that captured Ceausescu loyalists are being executed around the country. As violent as the events of the past week have been, many Romanians regard the firestorm that has swept Bucharest and the rest of the country as essential to clearing away the old regime. Now, the larger challenge, choosing a way forward for the new Romania. Arthur Kent, NBC News, Bucharest.
The Bush administration said today it was sending $500,000 in emergency medical supplies to Romania for the victims of the fighting there. More than a dozen countries have now recognized Romania's provisional government, which today announced its leadership and a promise for free elections by next April. Elections are something Romanians look forward to, but as NBC's George Lewis reports, there are other, more immediate needs to be met as well.
A father and daughter who were separated during the heaviest fighting in Bucharest reunited this morning. All over the city, as the gunfire died down, there was a sense of relief. At the old Communist Party Central Committee headquarters, laborers were demolishing the sign on front of the building. From now on, the communists will have to compete with other parties for their share of power. Inside Ceausescu's offices there, soldiers have taken over, inspecting the old government's records and belongings, conducting guided tours for the press. and expounding on the evils of the Ceausescu regime. It is kind of an organized anarchy, sometimes with no one in charge, sometimes with everyone in charge. The provisional government, the National Salvation Front, introduced the new leadership today. It is headed by one of Ceausescu's old political enemies, former Communist Party Secretary Ion Iliescu. At the moment, the National Salvation Front is running the Romanian government out of here, the studios of state television. An unusual situation, but according to one of the TV commentators, these are unusual times. Because of how they're being used, the studios are tightly guarded by the army. People who come here have to go through a series of elaborate security checks. The new government officials see radio and TV as their vital links to the public as they struggle to get organized.
People are starting now to organize, to get together, exchange ideas, to start a process which normally takes a lot of time.
Stores in Bucharest reopened today with long lines of people trying to buy food. Under Ceausescu, there were always long food lines and lots of empty shelves. The new government will be under pressure to do better.
Everybody fought for democracy, so we got to manage it, and we got to go forward for our liberty, for our good, for a better life.
Out in Romania's countryside, another challenge awaits the government, the need to modernize the antiquated system of agriculture. Farmers here are elated at the prospect of new liberties. They hope that their children can grow up in a society that is just and free and prosperous. Whether that hope is realized will be the ultimate test for the new government. George Lewis, NBC News, Bucharest.
With emotions running so high in Romania, there was an impassioned debate at the Bucharest television station over whether to show the goriest pictures of the Ceausescu execution. The younger members of the staff wanted to show everything, including the firing squad in action. Older members fought to keep those pictures off the air. The Soviet Communist Party today directed Mikhail Gorbachev to go to Lithuania to deal with the political crisis in that Soviet republic. Last week, Lithuanian communists declared an independent party. Gorbachev has accused the Lithuanians of playing up to nationalist separatist forces. Also coming up on NBC.
Now replaces former communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu, whose execution was shown today on Romanian television. He and his wife were killed by a firing squad following a secret military trial. Romanian television has been showing the tape to confirm that the death sentence had been carried out. Secret police forces loyal to the former leader are surrendering, while Romanians are celebrating their new freedom in the streets. It's believed Ceausescu was responsible for the deaths of 60,000 people during his 24-year reign. And a relief effort to Romania by members of Northwest medical teams is on hold tonight. The volunteer group is collecting donations of blood products, antibiotics, and syringes to take to Romania. But without giving them a reason, the U.S. State Department tonight delayed their trip. U.S. Ambassador Punch Green, who left Portland for Romania last month, talked to Northwest medical teams and Channel 2 today. He said the fighting there is easy.
I walked around town for the first time they let me. I went out with 2 security guards. The students have formed around, and there's a lot of candles lit for the people, for the very brave Romanians who died.
Ambassador Green says he's still not able to return to the U.S. Embassy in Bucharest. Nightline will have more on the situation in Romania right after our newscast.
In Panama,
children. This woman was attending the funeral of her 21-year-old friend, Dan Florian Ursu. They think he was killed by snipers during the battle for the television station.
He was a wonderful man. He was different from the other people. I don't know why only special men must die. He died immediately. He was shot in his heart, his great heart.
Dan Florian Ursu, 21 years old, one of 200 people buried today in Bucharest.
Medical supplies from Oregon are being collected for needy Romanians. The U.S. State Department is still deciding whether to send an assessment team to the ravaged country. That team includes a doctor and a pharmacist from Northwest Medical Teams, which is already gathering supplies.
Talking to some of the Romanian doctors, they said that many operations they perform, they lack even the suture material to perform the operations.
With cash donations, Northwest Medical Teams will buy antibiotics, suture material, painkillers, and other medical supplies. Northwest Medical Teams Director Ron Post also said the U.S. Ambassador to Romania, Alan Punch Green, a Portland businessman, took a walk in the streets today and felt, quote, relatively safe.
Whatever it
in Eastern Europe. But can democracy take root in a country that's never known it before? Good evening, I'm Chris Wallace, and this is Nightline. As the street fighting subsides, a provisional government begins to take shape in Romania. But with an economy in shambles, domestic dissent emerging, and no tyrant to oppose, what political direction will the Romanian people take?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Chris Wallace.
It looked like a scene from the end of World War II, or perhaps the height of the French Revolution. The bodies of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena lying crumpled against a firing squad wall. Romanian television broadcast those pictures today, leaving no doubt about the bloody change of power in that country. But if one era is clearly over, there is fear and confusion about where Romania goes next. Ceausescu ruled so brutally for the last quarter century that there is no opposition, no leading figure to rally round. Crowds in Bucharest today were already denouncing the new government as too heavily weighted with communists. And after years of deprivation with meager rations of food, heat, and electricity, Romanians are going to want some improvements in their lives fast. John Donvan reports from Romania on a dictator's final days and a country's uncertain steps into a new world.
Romania, the fifth communist domino to fall this year, the fifth triumph of the people. But this revolution was not like the others. This one spilled blood. The blood of soldiers and civilians. And today the population saw on television the blood of their president, Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu, a man who in life called himself a god, but whose 24 years in power most Romanians call a hell. It is because of Ceausescu that Romania's revolution is so different. More than rebelling against a system, a set of beliefs, the people were overthrowing a man.
I believe that Ceausescu established the most bizarre and most exaggerated personality cult the world has ever seen, perhaps certainly in the 20th century.
And it is this man who, for many years, was the American government's favorite communist ruler. Because he stood up to the Soviets, refusing, for example, to join the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia or to support the Soviet boycott of the Los Angeles Olympics, he was treated by Washington to preferential trading conditions, to financial loans, and perhaps most significant, Washington showed Ceausescu respect.
He was perceived in the West as a man who could perhaps stand up to Moscow and therefore create a division within the Warsaw Pact. He was seen as a man who could weaken the Soviet Empire.
But to the people who fought to topple him this week, Ceausescu was never more than a despot, a man who jailed dissenters, plundered the economy, gave positions of power to his own family, and destroyed the reputation of Romania among the family of nations. His death is one of the few events this week that has made Romanians smile.
It's my happy day, the day of Ceausescu died.
But this is what Ceausescu has bequeathed to his nation, a civil war his army was ill-prepared to fight, disorder that no one seems equipped to lead the nation away from. Because he'd always favored members of his secret police force with money and privileges, many of them were determined to fight to turn back the revolution against a uniformed army with bad equipment and poor training. Because he destroyed any organized opposition, the collection of people now claiming to lead the nation from a studio at Romanian TV is mostly inexperienced and has yet to make a convincing case for their own authority. Listening to them talk on about democracy, and then seeing the streets where a kind of martial law prevails, it can seem that really no one here is in charge.
The revolution was starting from the people, without leader. Was not a leader. Was not possible to have a leader, because if we try to have a leader, the security immediately obtained the information and it was killed.
It will not be easy for Romanians to get past the pain they suffered under Ceausescu, especially in these last few days in the war carried on by his secret police. Thousands have died. Thousands must now be buried. The people say they want democracy, but democracies do not always thrive where passions run high. And here they do run high. This revolution has been born in anger rather than joy. Ceausescu saw to that. I'm John Donovan for Nightline in Bucharest.
When we return, a discussion of events in Romania with the publisher of the first free newspaper there since the overthrow of Ceausescu, and with a State Department official responsible for Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe.
This is
tomorrow, the greenhouse effect, the White House response, and the big debate, if there's a problem at all. Watch ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings tomorrow.
Earlier this evening, we talked with Anton Uncu live from Romania. Mr. Uncu publishes the first free newspaper to be circulated in Romania since Nicolae Ceausescu was driven from power. And we began by asking him whether the Ceausescu loyalists were on the run today in Bucharest.
The situation is much clearer now, I would say. Ceausescu forces are completely or almost neutralized. There are still a few isolated elements who are completely desperate and have nothing to lose anymore.
We saw some crowds in Bucharest today saying that the new provisional government is too heavily weighted with communists and that they want to see other elements of the country also participate. How much popular support does the new government have?
For the time being, we try to clear the situation, to have some quiet times, and then we'll try to discuss if it's necessary or not necessary to maintain an attitude which would be pro-communist or anti-communist.
Do you believe that this new provisional government can last until elections next spring, or would you expect more anti-communist elements to be added to the government?
It's difficult to make some provisions, but I believe they can resist up to the elections. But there will be some problems. There will be problems because there are some opinions which do not agree with some of the actions taken by the Salvation Committee. But I believe it will be able to stay in place till spring, till the elections.
You are publishing the first free newspaper in Romania in 40 years. How is it being received on the street? Do people finally believe what they are reading in the paper?
Everybody was extremely happy in the street to see a newspaper entitled Free Romania as before, and a newspaper which was published during Romania, who was already freed. It was the same title, but a newspaper which was become free, because the exercise of freedom just starts now.
One final question, Mr. Uncu. Your country has very little experience with real democracy. Do you believe that it can now take hold and grow in Romania, that you will not fall back into another form of authoritarianism?
It would be a pity if we couldn't establish democracy and freedom in Romania. It would be really a pity. It won't be easy, of course. This newly acquired freedom to whom with which we are not used, it's a little bit difficult, poses some problems. I would like to mention the fact that we are still feeling a little bit guilty. We are still guilty because we have for so many years just put up with this kind of feudal regime, feudal caste, full of violence, lacking of culture, and greedy. We just put up with the situation, and this is why we are still feeling guilty.
Joining us now in our Washington bureau is Curtis Kamen, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Mr. Kamen heads the State Department task force that has been monitoring events in Romania round the clock since Thursday night. Mr. Kamen, let me begin by asking you the same question I asked Mr. Unku. What is the balance of forces now on the ground in Romania? Is the provisional government firmly in charge?
Yes, I think it's quite clear that the Romanian army and the new provisional government have established their authority in just about every part of the country. There are still some pockets of resistance from the security police here and there, but basically the military equation is now shifted distinctly to the new government.
So you don't view those pockets of resistance, the security police, as being any real threat to the control of this provisional government?
They're no threat, I think, to their control any longer. Certainly they can cause further bloodshed, and that's a problem for the new government.
Well, let me ask you about another threat to this new government, and that is the statements in the streets, some crowds chanting in Bucharest that there are too many communists in this provisional government, that there isn't enough reform. How much popular standing does this new government have?
Well, most of the members of the government, which calls itself the National Salvation Front, have broken with Ceausescu a long time ago, but they are either communists or former communists. And this is a revolution or a change of power that took place in the streets as the result of actions of students and of people who were just fed up with the years of Ceausescu and the years of communism. So I think the new government is probably going to encounter some resistance, some opposition, but they seem to be moving in the direction of allowing these people to have a voice, and perhaps the National Salvation Front will broaden itself and they may find a coalition. We really don't know at this point how that's all going to turn out.
Well, let me ask you about that, because in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia we saw precisely the same pattern, the so-called reform communists taking over from the hardliners, trying to maintain control, and the people in the streets saying the revolution has gone too far for that, and eventually the non-communists taking over in the case of Czechoslovakia. We'll see what happens in East Germany. Is that the scenario that you expect to see played out in Romania?
Well, there are a couple of differences. In East Germany and in Czechoslovakia, there were really no reform communists in any position to take over. Whereas there are reform-minded communists in Romania who gradually over the years had been frozen out by Ceausescu. So that would suggest that maybe it's possible for these people to obtain popular support. On the other hand, in GDR and in Czechoslovakia, there was nothing like this violence, and maybe this will be a reason that people will demand much more of a voice for the non-communists. We're just going to have to wait and see.
On the other hand, you also don't have any Havel or any Lech Wałęsa in Romania, as you did in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The lack of any kind of organized non-communist opposition, what impact will that have on the development of democracy in Romania?
Well, I think there is no opposition organized in formal groups, that's true. But the students, the intellectuals, some of the reform-minded people in the party have obviously been talking about this day for a long time. They came forth very rapidly with a program of 10 points of democratization, and they seem to have a good consensus on all of that. So I don't know exactly who the leaders will turn out to be. There is a new president now of Romania, proclaimed by this provisional government. But I think there may be a little more consensus and a little more structure there than we previously suspected.
This new president, Ion Iliescu, who is a communist but who has been on the outs with Ceausescu for almost 20 years, does he have any credibility with the public? Is he even known in Romania?
Yes, I think that's one reason that he was chosen to head this provisional government. He does have a name recognition. He does have a standing with many people, and he is known to have opposed Ceausescu and to have suffered, at least in career terms. Again, it's very hard to know whether that will translate into broad popular support.
The Army, as we mentioned, played a central role in the events of the last few days, and I want to ask you about that in just a moment. And when we return, we'll be joined in our discussion by a Romanian political analyst, now teaching political science in this country.
They called him a...
Joining us now from our Philadelphia News Bureau is Vladimir Tizmanianu, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Mr. Tizmanianu came to this country from Romania in 1981 and lectures in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. The Romanian army, as we mentioned, sir, played a central role in the fall of Ceausescu, finally refusing to carry out his orders to fire on the people. How firmly is the army committed to reform now?
First of all, I think that the army has long been humiliated by the Ceausescu regime. In this case, it's clearly a settlement of accounts between the army leadership and the former dictator and his clan. So it's clear that the army is definitely committed to pursuing the path of reforms. It is, however, an army still, packed with political officers, many of them formed in the Soviet Union. It is still an army very much indoctrinated and ideologically influenced by, scientific socialism, Marxism, Leninism, and all the other dogmas. So the problem is to completely de-ideologize the army, to let the army become, I think, that's one of the major requirements, I suppose, of the opposition in Romania, to let the army be indeed an independent force in society, to depoliticize the army.
You raised precisely the issue I want to get to, though. If the political situation doesn't stabilize fast, what is the danger that the army might seize control or back some other authoritarian figure?
I don't, basically I think that there is a possibility very soon for the army to purge itself of some of the political officers, and I'm not sure if the situation, degenerates into new forms of violence. I'm not that sure that this is a danger. Maybe, after all, the army can ensure a kind of stability in that country and perhaps, guarantee a minimal form of internal peace. I hope it's not going to be the case, and I very much hope that the provisional government would be able to perform along the lines of what they have promised in their initial platform, that means to organize free elections for April 1990.
Mr. Kaman, how confident are you that the army will play a progressive role in the future of Romania?
Well, I agree with Mr. Tismanianu that the army has been deprived over the years. They've been in a rivalry with the security police, and they have every reason to support a new government, and I think very few of them had any love for Ceausescu. There is, however, I think very little likelihood that the army itself will want to assert power. Essentially, they are supporting a set of political leaders who have given them the opportunity to get rid of Ceausescu, but I don't see any likelihood that they're going to take power.
Mr. Tismanianu, the Romanian economy has been ravaged for years with Ceausescu putting the people on very short rations of food and electricity, heat. How dramatically and how quickly do you expect that to change?
Okay, I think that most of the Romanian disaster has been man-made disaster or man-made tragedy, and it's very much linked to Ceausescu's nowadays documented ambitions, I would say even paranoid ambitions of full-fledged independence, total autarky, and so on. So once I dare say that whoever is going to succeed Nicolae Ceausescu as Romania's leader is going to be necessarily, almost objectively, the most beloved leader or the most popular leader in Romanian history. So I think it's very simple, up to a certain extent, for Mr. Iliescu and the new Prime Minister, Mr. Petru Roman. It would be very simple for them. I don't say it's simple in general, but there are some possibilities there that other communist countries do not have at this moment. First of all, Romania is a very rich country. Regardless of the way the Ceausescu tribe or clan or clique or the way you want to call them squeezed Romania of some of its natural resources, it is still a very rich country. Second, Romania, because of Ceausescu's ambition to get rid of the foreign debt, because he didn't want anybody to control his country and object to his human rights policies, because of this, let's say, financial independence acquired by Ceausescu, Romania has at this moment the possibility to get some Western loans. And third, according to a person I trust very much and who used to work for the World Bank for a long time, Romania has quite a positive balance in its trade with the West.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to break in here just for a moment, and we'll continue our discussion in a moment. Between this revolution and all the others in Eastern Europe this fall is that this one was violent. What impact, Mr. Kaman, do you expect that to have on developments in Romania in coming days?
Well, they have a period of recovery, both of the national psychology and also of the economy. There is damage to buildings, infrastructure, and all of that. But I think that most people expected in Romania and elsewhere in East Europe that it wouldn't go as easily in Romania as it did elsewhere. And what they now have to do is try to rebuild on the foundation that they have. In the short term, there will be some differences. I think in the long term, Romania will be very much like the other countries of Eastern Europe, seeking freedom and democracy.
Do you expect a long series of trials, executions, as we saw with Ceausescu?
There will be a problem of reprisals. There have been few of those problems so far elsewhere in East Europe. It's going to be much more difficult for the Romanians to accept the people that have been in the security police, for example, firing on unarmed civilians.
Mr. Tismanianu, what is the possibility, the likelihood that civil war, as we've seen in the last few days, will break out again in Romania?
I think it's not very likely. I think that what we have seen in Romania, basically, it was the violence exerted by the security police forces, the loyalists of the Ceausescu regime against the population. As an analyst of the Romanian phenomenon, I was expecting, because of the amount of rage that has been accumulated among Romanians, I was expecting Romanians to be, you know, I didn't want it, but I was expecting much more uproar and a kind of almost uncontrolled anarchic development. So far, I would say that the Romanians have behaved very much like their East European peers, and they have reacted, of course, to violence and aggression, brutalities on the part of the security police, but there is very little looting and lynching despite of this extraordinary persecution and, as I said, almost sadistic brutalities.
Mr. Kamen, we only have about 30 seconds left. What do you think is the likelihood that there will be, as now promised, fair, free elections in Romania by next spring?
I think it would be very hard for any government now to deny that to people who have shed their blood to achieve it. And so I look forward to it. I think it's definitely going to happen.
And as in other Eastern European countries, the likelihood that all of the communists will be swept from power?
I wouldn't say that. I think there may be either a combination of communists and non-communists, some sort of a coalition, maybe a multi-party system with several parties sharing power.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much. Mr. Kamen, Mr. Tismanianu, thank you both very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
And that's our report for tonight. I'm Chris Wallace in Washington. For all of us at ABC News, good night.
This has been Nightline. For a printed transcript, please send $3 to 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007.
In Sibiu, where Ceausescu's son was party boss, patients were shot in their beds. The town water supply was poisoned. After a generation of pent-up anger and resentment over the abuses of the Ceausescu regime, Romanians are now openly celebrating news that he and his wife Elena were tried and executed. People watch television in fascinated silence as the trial is shown again and again, the most popular rerun on Romanian TV. This is their reaction when they see Elena Ceausescu dead. The end of the Ceausescu nightmare is the beginning of Romania's return to normalcy. Medical aid is arriving from all over the world. There is food in the stores more than ever now, because it isn't being saved for the privileged anymore or being exported to keep Romania from having foreign debts. Times are changing fast. The symbol of these new times is Romania's old flag, with its communist emblem cut from the center. Ceausescu's regime with its heart torn out. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Bucharest.
Inside the military headquarters, people wait in the cold for a glimpse of anyone captured and brought in. They've lit so many candles for the victims that makeshift shrines are now pools of wax and oil. Tanks still stand guard. The hated past remains too fresh in memories for anyone to feel completely comfortable about the future. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Timișoara.
All over Bucharest today, people were shouting about democracy, taking delight in disorder. In one building, writers were rising from the underground, formulating their demands in a country where until yesterday, you needed a license to own a typewriter. In another smoke-filled room, students were voting on what to call their new union in a university where until yesterday, smoking and voting were both against the law.
We try to build now. That's it.
In this housing development, people were walking to their well this morning. They have no running water or heat or indoor plumbing that works, and the outdoor toilets have not been completed. A peasant woman forced into this place last March said she could still not believe two miraculous events: the death of Ceausescu and the fact that she actually bought meat this morning. Other miracles were visible in the streets of Bucharest, people buying real coffee for the first time in 10 years. The provisional government announced no more rationing, no more food exports to the Soviet Union. Another export will be stopped: Romanian children. Under Ceausescu, orphans were a cash crop to be sold for adoption in the West. Abortions were illegal, the orphanages were full. Those not sold were prepared from birth to join the secret police. One of Ceausescu's policies came back to haunt him. In 1967, he outlawed birth control to increase the size of his empire. The baby boom he created, today's students and young workers, are the people who took to the streets and clamored for his downfall. The police were being hunted down in the streets today and below, in the vast network of tunnels which everyone knew existed, which no one outside the palace guard had ever seen before. Ordinary people were seeing things and each other differently. As of today, they are not required by law to call each other comrade anymore. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
28 months. American lives are at stake in Grenada.
The battle for the Falklands is over. Britain...
Go ahead. Make my day.
Go ahead. Make a wish.
I wish I were big.
Substance there, that's pine tar.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
I'll have what she's having.
9 persons killed.
The Miami Police Department is utilizing all of its resources.
It's a war zone. There's a war going out there.
He fired a minimum of 106 rounds.
Children should not have to die in American schoolyard.
A man walked into the crowded McDonald's restaurant carrying an automatic rifle.
There's a crazy man in there shooting.
Come on! All we are saying, the fact is give peace a chance.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Is that you?
T-minus 2 minutes and counting. The liquid hydrogen replenished.
I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore as far as he can, as deep as he can into the unknown.
90 seconds and counting. The 51L mission.
I'm very proud and humbled to have been a part of the space program. I think there is an awful lot to be done. The space shuttle is probably the most versatile vehicle we could have to do that.
T-minus 1 minute and counting. Sound suppression, water.
I'm very proud to be part of the program at NASA. The mission is a great mission. We're looking forward to it. And I think we understand it's ready to go. We're looking forward to going to fly.
T-minus 45 seconds and counting. The solid rocket boost.
One of the things that I hope to bring back into the classroom is to make that connection with the students that they too are part of history, that the space program belongs to them, and to try to bring them up with the space age.
T-minus 10, 9,
If you allow risks to keep you from doing the things in life that pleasure you and make you what you are and make you feel better about yourself, I think you're shortchanging yourself.
And liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Roger, go and throttle up.
We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
Such events always seem to be etched into our memories, but this was also a decade of momentous international events. It began as one American president called the Soviet Union an evil empire, but came to a close as another American president called for an end to the Cold War. We'll have more on those past events that reshaped our future tomorrow.
Of the Securitate. It has been widely reported that Ceausescu recruited many of his security guard when they were teenage orphans. The result was a protection force which had virtually been brainwashed from childhood. In this underground operations center, the Securitate stored thousands of bullets, much of them made in America. More than a dozen personal safe deposit boxes had been emptied in a hurry. In this private restaurant, the Securitate ate far better than the Romanian citizens they terrorized. There was a complete secret chemical laboratory. Modern lab equipment was in every corner. There were specially made briefcases to hold chemicals with hidden connectors for rubber hoses which ran out the bottom. This soldier said the dissidents sometimes were brought here to be chemically tortured. This could not be confirmed. However, we did find small containers of poison gas. All over the floor are clues to what might have gone on here. Here's a gas mask. And lo and behold, a bunch of business cards. And on the business card, Nicolae Ceausescu, General Secretary, Romanian Republic. Ceausescu himself has already been punished for whatever he sanctioned in these rooms. The search continues for those who carried out the work of the Securitate. Mike Lee, ABC News, Bucharest.
These are the developments. 3 other members of Ceausescu's family were arrested in Romania today, while in Austria, his oldest brother, a diplomat, was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. In Czechoslovakia today, the triumphant return of Alexander Dubček, the man who led the Prague Spring Reform movement in 1968, only to see it crushed by a Soviet-led invasion. Dubček was elected to the number 3 post in the new government, Speaker of Czechoslovakia.
Received the unit.
Why aren't you? Common sense oat bran waffles from Eggo. Oat bran you can actually smile about.
Who is it? Who is it? I'm always mistaken for Giorgio. I'm just as fabulous, but smarter. I'm Primo. Why pay?
The TV building that houses the provisional government. Forces loyal to ousted dictator Nicolae Ceausescu ignored a government ultimatum to surrender or die. The new government continued its sweep, arresting 3 more of Ceausescu's relatives. A 4th, his brother, was found dead, apparently a suicide. For the first time in years, residents are buying real coffee and greeting each other without the required comrade. The week of revolution has left the country in need of help, though. Trains are leaving neighboring Hungary carrying blood plasma and medical equipment, and the Red Cross has raised $4 million to help out.
A Romanian artist in Portland is donating her work to help citizens in her homeland. Maria Tomos paints icons on glass, a painstaking technique that requires painting a mirror image on the back side of the glass. It's an ancient art that is traced back to the beginnings of Christianity. Tomos came to America herself about 13 years ago. Her paintings begin at about $200. All the proceeds will go to the Romanian Relief Fund.
They still have shortages, and the fights are still going on. And of course, we are very worried, and we'll do anything to help them. And we'd like to have everybody joining us in this action.
You'll find the art exhibit at the West Hills Unitarian Fellowship Church. That's at 8470 Southwest Olison Road in Portland. The paintings are on display until January 6th.
The lack of snow on Oregon's mountains is now beginning to concern those outside the ski industry. Today, the chief of the state.
And on this Christmas Eve, that government is pleading for peace. Citizens join rebel soldiers today in battling secret police still loyal to ousted dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu and his wife were captured yesterday, 3 days after fleeing the presidential palace. Today's fighting is said to be savage, and the morgues in Bucharest are full. Thousands of other Romanians are dead in the countryside. 2 American journalists were wounded today. They are being evacuated to Yugoslavia. Family members and some staff are being evacuated from the American embassy. The daughter of American Ambassador Alan Punch Green of Portland is on her way to Bulgaria and then Frankfurt. The Green's daughter says her father remains safe inside the embassy in Bucharest. For Romanians now living in this country, understanding English news reports can be impossible. But as Don Reese reports, a special bilingual broadcast on a local radio station is helping new immigrants stay up to date with developments in Eastern Europe.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to broadcast in the next 30 minutes a series of Romanian carols. We would like to dedicate these carols to the victims in Romania.
For Gabriel Gerasim, the night is filled with joy and sorrow.
He and his radio co-host Carmen Costin know thousands of their fellow countrymen are dying in a bitter fight for freedom.
We're sad, but we're happy. You know, it's just, we have never thought that we would see this in our lifetimes. We have never thought that we would see this. We just thought that communism is there to stay.
In Romania, a 24-year nightmare is over.
Costin and Gerasim broadcast news, music, and commentary every Saturday night on radio station KKEY. Their listeners include some 3,000 immigrants living in the Portland area.
Următoarele colinde victimelor orașelor Timișoara și Bucharest.
Romanian families like this one now listening in amazement to news of sweeping reforms in Eastern Europe.
I have a very big joy, but I suffer a lot for the families who are there.
Maria Chokina came to this country to escape years of persecution. She is deeply saddened now by news of widespread fighting as loyalists to the Ceausescu regime battle Romanian citizens.
Because instead of being free and to be able to enjoy this Christmas, they're forced because of this cruel man to die.
Stay tuned for an interview with the editor of a Romanian newspaper published in...
Tonight's guest on the Romanian Hour is Ovid Vasilescu, sentenced to 15 years hard labor in a work camp while still a teenager for his political beliefs. Vasilescu's newspaper, Liberty, is read by Romanians throughout the U.S.
Could you tell us what are your impressions about the transformation taking place right now in Romania?
Oh, it's grateful. I hope every Romanian hopes that soon our country is going to be freed. I hope that soon everything is going to be set up and the communist defeat will be all over.
Despite fighting and death, these Romanians are confident the new year will bring new freedom and new hope throughout Eastern Europe.
This is KKY 1150 AM. We are the only radio program serving the Romanian community throughout the Northwest.
Don Reese, News 8.
Not to be overlooked during this holiday season is Hanukkah, the Jewish observance of their ancestors.
Alan Punch Green now living in the U.S. Embassy rather than the U.S. Ambassador's residence because of the continued fighting in Romania. His wife Joan Green safely escaped to Germany with other Westerners. Green's family reports that he received a phone call from President Bush this morning, but they did not know the contents of the conversation.
Just on that, communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife have been executed. The sudden announcement said that they had been convicted at a secret trial. There were few details, no independent confirmation. President Bush gave U.S. recognition late today to the anti-Ceausescu coalition now claiming power. By most accounts, the civil war continues. Amid the killing and confusion, Christmas carols were sung openly for the first time in decades. Martha Teichner is in Romania.
Nicolae Ceausescu și Elena Ceausescu.
The announcement on Christmas night that Ceausescu and his wife had been tried and executed was a shock even to the nation that hated them. They were accused of murdering 60,000 of their own people, for destroying their country, and then trying to escape after pocketing $1 billion. It was a stunning end to the first Christmas Romanians have celebrated openly in a generation. They did it in the spirit of revolution. And for the first time since Ceausescu's overthrow, they dared to feel as if they'd won. A Christmas peace enforced by tanks, a fragile and uneasy calm, but one that is spreading as Romania's army strengthens its position. It seemed just safe enough to light candles at the foot of a Christmas tree at a spot where students were killed in rioting last week. At every corner where someone died, there were more candles. Sadness and celebration have been joined forever here at Christmas. Christmas came to Timișoara, where the uprising began, in the form of medical aid. Here, as many as 12,000 people may have been killed. Even today, heavy fighting was reported, as the army hunted down and caught more holdout members of the secret police still loyal to Nicolae Ceausescu. In Bucharest, soldiers and self-appointed vigilantes led CBS News inside the wrecked royal palace in order to show off a captured colonel from Ceausescu's elite guard. A man clearly out to save his own skin now that the game is up and Ceausescu is gone. Romania's most remarkable Christmas, the day they dug graves for some of the people who died to make it happen. It was a day of chaos and celebration and vengeance. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Bucharest.
Revolution has not come gently to Romania. Days after Ceausescu and his clan fled or tried to, the army is still blasting the buildings from which power has been exercised these last 40 years. The Communist Party Secretariat, Ceausescu's private office. Shell after shell, less a military tactic than a fit of rage. People taking a little Christmas stroll became terrified spectators, full of the thrill and fear of disbelief. The old order had ended. The harder they are, the bigger the fall. There's no question of talking to the erstwhile rulers of Romania. This is not Hungary or Czechoslovakia. Anyone loyal to Ceausescu is a wanted man. An armored regiment is engaged against a handful of snipers who refuse to die or surrender and who have nowhere to go. The Battle of Bucharest seems to be almost over, but it is ending not with a whimper, but with a bang. The battle for Romanian television ended last night. This morning, there were no windows or lights or certainty that it would not begin again. But the army moved in more tanks, soldiers dug fresh positions, and people came to work because it was worth it.
We hope to be free. After 40 years. You can't understand that.
TV Romania is the voice of the revolution and much more. It is the military command post and the seat of government because the generals and politicians who are running the country right now are here around the clock, broadcasting plans for the future, memories of the past. Today they were bringing in paintings and Persian carpets from what was the home of Nicolae Ceausescu, the man who starved his people as an economic policy. The house was guarded by soldiers instead of secret police today. The streets were as empty as they've always been. Under Ceausescu, the entire neighborhood was off limits to ordinary people, so many of whom hoped for the verdict which was delivered.
He and his family, I think that they will be shot in the head.
At the Basilica of St. Constantine and Elena, 3 wise men of the Romanian Orthodox Church officiated today at a Christmas Mass, while an entire nation, a largely Christian nation, was reliving some of the oldest themes of mankind, the death of tyrants, the birth of hope. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
In the case of Ben, his wife were executed after a military court found them guilty of genocide, stealing state funds, and trying to escape prosecution. There has been no independent confirmation. NBC's Arthur Kent is in Bucharest tonight.
Nicolae Ceausescu și Elena Ceausescu au fost...
The announcement on Romanian television was brief.
Sentința a rămas definitivă și a fost executată.
Both Ceausescu and his wife were condemned to death. The execution, the announcer said, has been carried out. Television pictures tonight most Romanians thought they'd never see. The man they called the tyrant, Nicolae Ceausescu, brought unceremoniously into custody in an armored personnel carrier. And, before appearing before a special military tribunal, the former dictator is given a medical examination. Many Romanians find it hard to believe the man who ruled them with a ruthlessness verging on fanaticism is finally gone.
I'm truly happy and I am emotional that I know that it will be true. Okay. It will be okay.
Tonight, a member of the National Salvation Council sang a Christmas carol on Romanian television, a carol banned in this country for 40 years because of its celebration of the birth of Christ. The Romanian army's big guns, guns that have roared through the weekend, were silent in Bucharest, the capital, this Christmas Day. But in the narrow streets of the city center, soldiers and civilians watched for snipers, the die-hard Securitate troops still loyal to Nicolae Ceausescu. Yesterday's heavy fighting has kept the army and the people on edge. One hotspot, Romanian television. Army units return sniper fire from the courtyard, protecting studios that have become the Provisional Reform Government's virtual seat of power. In the most recent battle here, Securitate gunmen closed in on the studio building. The army fought back. NBC cameraman Max Mattioli and soundman Stefano Generali were caught in the crossfire, but emerged unharmed. Later, reinforcements arrived. one of the citizen volunteer units that have taken up arms in the past 2 days to defend the new government and help defeat the old regime. They lack experience. Have you been trained in the use of that rifle?
No.
This electrician last week went to the barricades barehanded.
Without gun. Now I have a gun.
The growing defense force today helped bring calm to the streets, relief for civilians weary of the sounds of battle. If the fighting has eased, the paranoia in Bucharest has not. At barricades like this one, citizens' committees check the papers of every passing motorist and most pedestrians, still on the lookout for Ceausescu's men. It's a menacing atmosphere broken only by the faintest traces of Christmas cheer. Except perhaps in the churches of Bucharest. Here, the celebration of Christmas Mass has risen above the turmoil in the streets. Tonight, Romania's faithful mark not only the birth of Christ, they pray for the rebirth of a nation, their Romania. Arthur Kent, NBC News, Bucharest.
The Bush administration expressed regret that the trial of Ceausescu did not take place in an open and public fashion. But almost immediately after word of his death, the United States established diplomatic relations with Romania's new government. Recognition came as well today from the Soviet Union. Beyond the politics and violence of Romania, there was much giving on this Christmas Day, and NBC's George Lewis now on help for Romania's victims.
These Romanians had not counted on having to do this on Christmas Day, bury one of the victims of the violence here. The priest would rather have been celebrating a holiday mass, and the heavy equipment operator who was digging scores of holes for more graves would rather have been at home with his family. There will be many more burials like this one.
There are thousands, and they are our heroes,
There are also living heroes here on this Christmas. The medical teams who have been working around the clock to tend the wounded. This hospital has treated more than 600 casualties. 90 have died so far. It's a depressing way for these people to practice their profession. The doctor in the yellow surgical cap is part of a team of French physicians who gave up their holidays to come here and help out. Others came from afar bearing gifts. The Germans were here with a plane load of medical supplies as their contribution. The holiday did not ease the tension in the streets. Military checkpoints are everywhere, troops searching for the remnants of the Ceausescu secret police. Anyone suspected of being a collaborator is detained. Goodwill toward men is not always in evidence here. But in spite of all the problems and the suffering, there is a spirit of triumph. These people feel they have won for themselves the best Christmas present of all: liberty.
It is doubtlessly a good Christmas present, but it would have been better if everything would have been quiet right now, so we could have a real Christmas celebration.
This Christmas, people can speak freely against communism. They can put up Christmas decorations in public places. Two things unheard of in 40 years. But they must also take time to mourn the dead and remember the terrible price Romania is paying for freedom. George Lewis, NBC News.
Will prompt the dictator's secret forces to surrender.
And the new government of Romania officially received U.S. diplomatic recognition today, delivered by the American ambassador Alan Punch Green. Green left his home in Portland less than a month ago to assume the post in Bucharest. This morning, he presented the message in person from President Bush to the new deputy prime minister. Later, the ambassador talked with Northwest medical teams and Channel 2 News by telephone. Green says the fighting has eased and the gunfire is only sporadic.
I walked around town for the first time they let me. I went out with 2 security guards. The students have formed around, and there's a lot of canvas lit for the people, for the very brave Romanians who died.
Ambassador Green says he is still unable to return to the American embassy near the airport in Bucharest, which has been the scene of some of the heaviest fighting. Mrs. Green, other American dependents, and staff left Bucharest by automobile caravan and arrived safely in West Germany last week. And as the fighting appears to be decreasing in Romania, medical supplies are beginning to reach the wounded. Shipments from the Soviet Union and France have arrived, and the U.S. State Department has asked the Northwest Medical Team from Portland to assess the needs in Romania. And Jim Hyde reports the team may leave as soon as tomorrow.
The Northwest medical teams have responded generously before to pleas for help from Mexico City, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. That's why anxious Romanian emigres came to the offices of the volunteer organization in Tigard. And the U.S. State Department has asked the team to learn firsthand about specific medical help in Romania.
They'll go possibly as early as tomorrow to assess the needs as to what long-range help is needed in Romania. At this time, we've been told by the ambassador that medical personnel at the moment may not be needed.
Team leaders talked to Ambassador Punch Green in Bucharest by telephone. He relayed the request of the new government there, voiced by the Deputy Prime Minister. No foreign doctors and nurses yet, but all kinds of medical supplies are needed.
Surgical packs, scalpels, bandages, intraoperative medications, both antibiotics and otherwise. Probably blankets. We could use IV solutions and fluids.
Northwest medical teams have a small amount of such material on hand, but much more will be needed, from sterile syringes to blood transfusion kits. The volunteers are asking for donations of supplies from medical and pharmaceutical companies and cash to purchase more. Timing is critical.
What we would like to achieve is expedite everything. They need all the supplies right away. So a delay of one day might mean dozens or hundreds of lives we can save. So I urge everybody who is in charge to cut all the red tape and just let it go.
A Romanian Airlines cargo plane is being ready to pick up the material collected in several
donations to buy supplies. And surprise, surprise, it was a busy day at the stores today. We'll show you all that and more at 6.
Thank you, Kim.
A moment off the beaten path now, a stop in the woods.
Made by photographer Jim
Radio's office, still ringed by
Revolution back in Panama.
And Charles Carrault on the road and counting birds in this season of partridges in the opposed leader Ceausescu, photographs of Ceausescu on trial and his body after he and his wife were executed by firing squad. As fierce civil war apparently tapered off somewhat today, the first stress cracks appeared in the new Romanian provisional government and signs of more turmoil and possible violence to come. Bob Simon is on the scene.
He was defiant to the end. The trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, broadcast on Romanian television tonight, revealed the captured leader and his wife Elena refusing to recognize the court which was accusing them of crimes against the people. Minutes later, they were dead, executed by a firing squad at an undisclosed location.
In Bucharest today, people said it was unfortunate that the man who called himself the greatest Romanian in history could die only once, and so quickly.
We all say he died too much easier. He should have been punished much more terribly.
His legacy was being dealt with outside Bucharest today. A new cemetery was under construction. The old one did not have room for 3,000 fresh graves for the victims of Ceausescu's last massacre. Children and old people, but students mainly. Students who demonstrated at Bucharest University last Saturday when Ceausescu called in the guns. New heroes, new leaders. The new government of Romania was displayed on television today. The president, Ion Ionescu, credentials, a senior communist who'd been demoted by Ceausescu and who was a friend of Gorbachev. He promised free elections in April. The tanks were still in the streets today, and there were other signs of extraordinary times, like food. More variety in more stores than people could remember. And newspapers with names like Spark of the People, Truth, Liberty. New first editions coming out every day in such demand that self-appointed town criers read them out loud to crowds. Real reprisals have not begun yet, but the old guard is being rounded up. Familiar faces spotted by people who'd been imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured. Ceausescu's poet laureate sought refuge at the American embassy, but was pulled away by an angry crowd. And more anger is coming to the surface. The people of Romania took the extraordinary step of killing their old leader, and many are saying that the new leaders they saw on television today wear too many of the same Stalinist stripes. The Romanian Revolution may have just begun. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
President Bush announced a $500,000 emergency aid package for Romania today, mostly medical supplies to be distributed through the International Red Cross. Additional U.S. aid...
But found them guilty of, quote, genocide and other grave crimes. Also, there is concern tonight about the future of Romania, where the popular uprising against the Ceausescu regime was so sudden that little thought and virtually no preparation had been given to ruling Romania without him. Our first report is from ABC's John Donovan in Bucharest.
They were shouting, "Show us the bodies," in Bucharest Central Square this morning, demanding proof from the new government that Nicolae Ceausescu was finally and truly dead. 2 hours later, Romanian television gave them this proof: roughly edited pictures of Ceausescu and his wife in captivity, and then Ceausescu after the firing squad. But whatever satisfaction his death gives Romanians, and that appears to be plenty, it means they are now left with no one they can all hate together. That hatred, more than anything else, is what drove Romania's revolution. Now all the talk is of organizing a democracy. But organization seems a skill Romania's new leaders are still only learning. The new government is self-proclaimed, mostly intellectuals and politicians who suffered under Ceausescu. Ion Iliescu is the new president, a much-admired man who once lost his job as a Communist Party secretary for criticizing Ceausescu. But few of the new faces have a real following among the people. Their lack of experience and Romania's lack of any real tradition of democracy in its long history worries Romanians, like this former intelligence officer who broke with Ceausescu years ago.
We don't know to live in liberty. We don't know what is democracy. And the biggest danger is anarchy.
But right now, only the army stands in the way of anarchy. The civil war of the last few days is not quite over. Soldiers are still searching out members of Ceausescu's secret police who tried to turn back the people's revolution with gunfire. Today was quieter than yesterday. People are beginning to clean up this battered city, but they are angry rather than joyous. For a nation trying to feel its way toward democracy, there could have been better ways to start. John Donovan, ABC News, Bucharest.
Late today, Romanian television showed new pictures of Ceausescu at his trial. It showed an angry Ceausescu arguing with his judges. "I do not recognize this court," he said. "Read the Constitution." To which an off-screen voice replied, "We've read the Constitution. We know it better than you." Unlike other countries in Eastern Europe, there's no long-standing opposition movement in Romania to move in and take charge. During the 24 years of the Ceausescu regime, day-to-day living was so harsh that it was difficult for most people to think about the future. Imagine living in a country with so little electricity that each household was allowed just one 40-watt light bulb. In Romania tonight, the future remains difficult and uncertain. Here's ABC's Mike Lee.
This was the way many Romanians were coping with the upheaval in the streets, by clinging to the only routine they know, tracking down scarce supplies of food before they disappear from the shelves. Food is a bitter political symbol because the communists exported most agricultural produce to pay off the foreign debt. This store reported a run on local champagne, as some Romanians spent up to a half-month's salary per bottle to celebrate what they hope will soon be a better standard of living. The children do not fully comprehend that history is in the making. At times, their faces seem to reflect the strain of not being able to play outside because their parents fear they may be shot by snipers. Some kids roam their apartment houses, making a game of singing holiday songs. Like most Romanians, Nicoleta has for years been on the waiting list to buy a refrigerator. She must store her food outside the kitchen window.
Building a new life for these Romanians will not be easy. The Communist Party ran the country's economy into the ground. All the major institutions, everything from banks to factories to farms, even the local supermarket, have all been built and run on the old-style Stalinist system of central planning. That cannot be changed quickly. Leaders of the Romanian Orthodox Church, who have long kept their political opinions to themselves, are suddenly speaking out.
It's great freedom for our country, and the church will have its place in the life of the nation.
Uncensored newspapers have been appearing for the first time. With her friends at her side, Nicoleta summed up the mood of ordinary Romanians.
I can't explain you. I'm very happy, but sometimes I want to cry.
With so many civilians having been killed, families in Bucharest today brought their dead to a newly created cemetery. Amid the grief, centuries-old rituals were observed. Bread and cakes were offered for the spiritual travel to heaven. The news of Ceausescu's death did little to relieve the agony of those whose loved ones never knew more than a few hours of freedom. Mike Lee, ABC News, Bucharest.
The Bush administration has recognized the new provisional government of Romania, but criticized it for conducting the Ceausescu trial and executions in secret.
No more communists, the marchers chant, at the palace of the party that was Nicolae Ceausescu's puppet. The death of Ceausescu, confirmed by this picture, leaves a kind of political vacuum in the country he ruled absolutely, and his trial and his firing squad, quick and secret, raise questions about the style of those who want to succeed him. The new provisional government is headed by men whose qualifications include having been among the many communist officials Ceausescu dumped along the way. Tuesday, they ruled that all security forces will henceforth be under the army, an effort to distance themselves from the repression of the old regime. But it's not clear the public will buy that. To many, the party and Ceausescu are identical, and Ceausescu was the devil.
Hitler was a very small kid in comparison with this paranoid, because he is paranoid. He was paranoid. And, you know, we cannot be very happy in this moment because too many people are still dying in this moment on the streets, in the building.
The gunfire that ruined the peace of Christmas night subsided Tuesday after the army secured the Central Committee Palace where die-hard Ceausescu loyalists had been holding out. The heaviness of the fighting plain to see. And also the affection of the people for the soldiers and all who fought to topple the dictator. For Ceausescu's Securitate troops who've been killing soldiers and civilians, a different kind of reception. Behind the wall, a cemetery where lie the great and good of Romania's history. Right here, a public park is being turned into a cemetery for those who will be the heroes of this revolution. More than 200 graves, a fraction of what will be needed for those who have died in Bucharest. Some of them old enough to have known Romania before the communists took over. Some who never knew anything but Ceausescu.
I can't call this man Romanian. He is not a Romanian. He is just a monster, an assassin who destroyed his people and who killed children.
Dan Florian Ursu, age 21. A student member of the uprising, mourned by his childhood friend.
He was a wonderful man. He was different from the other people. I don't know why only special men must die.
Dan Florian was missing for 2 days before they found his body at a hospital. They think he was killed by snipers at the TV station.
I guess nobody knows exactly. He was already died. I guess he died immediately. He was shot in his heart. His great heart.
Richard Blystone, CNN, Bucharest.
One local political scientist predicts even more violence ahead for Romania. Ladis Christoph says the overthrow of the government happened so quickly, there's bound to be more fallout. Pat Duggan has that.
Ladis Christoph hasn't seen the home he grew up in since 1944, when the Soviets overran Romania. Today, Christoph is a semi-retired political science professor and not at all surprised by the quick execution of Nicolae Ceausescu. Christoph believes it was the only way to get the secret police to surrender.
To eliminate the possibility in anybody's mind that they could free him somehow and that the whole revolution can be turned back.
To illustrate just how oppressed the Romanian people were, Christoph consults his rather sizable library, producing 2 books. One, a tribute to Stalin on his 70th birthday. The second book, dedicated to Ceausescu, is much larger.
This is the book published as an homage to Ceausescu on his 60th birthday. And how much bigger is the book published to Ceausescu.
Christoph predicts even more violence ahead in Romania, not only against the secret police, but also against anyone in a position of power, since Ceausescu demanded such absolute loyalty. Christoph made his own escape from Romania in 1948 by swimming across the Danube River. He has returned several times, twice as a Fulbright scholar, but never has been able to visit what once was his family home. That part of Romania was annexed to the Soviet Union.
But up to now, the Soviets did not let you go into the villages, only into certain so-called open towns. But I was hoping that now, with the change in the Soviet Union, I would be able to go also to see my village.
Life for Christoph these days is spent on his farm near Yamhill with his wife Jane, also a college professor. Christoph says he picked this spot because it reminded him so much of the countryside he knew as a boy. Pat Duggan, the 10 o'clock news.
A Lake Oswego surgeon will be part of a
He credits the local Panamanian people as the true heroes in that conflict, and he says he plans to return to Panama as early as next month. Near Enumclaw, Bob Branham.
The new government of Romania has thrown out some of the most restrictive laws of the old regime. Newspapers, which have not been censored by the government, are now available. The new leaders also are getting rid of a law that prevented contact with foreigners and another that limited travel. It's also scrapping a law that banned the ownership of typewriters. The provisional government, which is serving only until the free elections in April, also chose a chairman for the governing council. The sight of former leader Ceausescu and his wife, shot and killed by a firing squad, was enough to persuade some of those loyal to them to surrender today. Meanwhile, the people the Ceausescu regime killed are being buried. In Bucharest, they had to turn this park into a cemetery to accommodate all the bodies. Some were old enough to remember a time when Ceausescu did not rule Romania. For others, he was the only leader they knew.
The population lived in poverty. Well, elsewhere this morning, fighting in Romania has subsided, but profound problems face that country as the new government takes over today.
Discord has risen over the provisional government, and as NBC's Dennis Murphy reports, building a new society from the ashes of a brutal past makes change difficult.
The provisional government, the president, a Communist Party officer, his prime minister and defense minister have been issuing proclamations from the television station. But there have been anti-communist demonstrations in the streets of Bucharest. They have chanted "Down with communism" and were successful in demanding that Iliescu, the provisional leader, meet with them and give them television time to read their platform. About 10 small political parties have formed in the last few days of chaos. 1 person in 4 in this former police state was a government informer. No one knows who to trust. The victims of the revolution, the hundreds killed in Bucharest street fighting, are being buried today. They threw themselves at a hated and decadent regime, but building a new society may prove as difficult as toppling a tyrant.
That was Dennis Murphy reporting. Food and medicine is pouring into Romania now. Japan has donated $1 million, the U.S. $500,000, and locally supplies from the Northwest Medical Team are being gathered for that country.
In other news,
Romania's new leaders are struggling to consolidate the revolution while the Romanian people see for themselves how it ended for Nicolae Ceausescu. Martha Teichner reports from Bucharest.
Defiant, arrogant, disbelieving. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena refused to recognize the secret court that executed them. Last night, Romanian television showed their trial, including Ceausescu's unrepentant harangues at his unseen accusers, his attitude to the end: "You can't do this to us." Captured members of the secret police still loyal to Ceausescu will face special military courts with the power to administer instant justice. Romania's provisional government has ordered the holdouts to turn themselves in by nightfall tomorrow or face the firing squad. The new government has used the force of Romania's suddenly respectable army, hoping to put an end to the bloody fighting that followed Ceausescu's overthrow. But already questions are being asked about whether the revolution has been hijacked by Ceausescu's old guard, simply voicing new rhetoric while solidifying their power. The new president, Ion Iliescu, was Communist Party secretary until Ceausescu stripped him of power. He is a personal friend of Mikhail Gorbachev. But communism with a new face isn't enough for the thousands of students who died, not just for an end to Ceausescu's brand of tyranny, but for democracy. There are so many dead that only the bodies that have been identified are being buried in the rows and rows of hurriedly dug graves. The rest are being trucked away and burned. The price of freedom has been high, but Romanians have proved they are willing to fight for it, no matter what the cost. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Bucharest.
Soviet leader Gorbachev.
Provisional government is beginning to dismantle the dictatorship of executed Nicolae Ceausescu. The new government includes communist officials as well as opposition leaders. They're lifting repressive laws and rounding up members of the hated security police for trial. The new government warns Ceausescu's followers to surrender by tomorrow or face execution.
Is trying to take shape and to take control of that war-torn country. Military tribunals have been set up throughout Romania to try members of the hated security forces. Correspondent Mike Lee is joining us live from Bucharest. He has the latest on the developing situation over there. Mike?
Mike, what we're seeing basically this morning is a scramble for power to fill the vacuum left by Ceausescu. On the one hand, we have the provisional government composed primarily of people who oppose Ceausescu, some of whom may have been in the party, and they are promising elections by next year. However, we're beginning to see the formation of other opposition parties. For example, the Romanian Democratic Party, comprised primarily of young people. They've been holding a rally, and they say that the provisional leadership is too closely tied with the establishment. So what we have is a number of groups saying we all want democracy, but we're the ones who ought to lead this country in that direction. In terms of the atmosphere here this morning, it's basically calm. There has been some sniping early this morning, in fact, right outside our hotel. This is because some of the secret police are still in hiding. The government today said that those police have until tomorrow to turn themselves in, or they will be tracked down and submitted to military justice. In other words, summary execution. As far as the general outlook is concerned, it's a day-by-day situation. Most of what the people find out here, they find out from Romanian television, which is controlled by the provisional government, and with the other opposition groups claiming that they ought to have more access. So already we're seeing that form of democracy, which could get even more volatile, at least politically, in the near future. Mike?
Thank you, Mike. Mike Lee reporting this morning from Bucharest.
Enter today.
It is now 8:38. More than 40 years ago, Princess Ileana of Romania was exiled from that country by the communists, along with the remaining members of her royal family. Her father, King Ferdinand, had ruled the country till his death in 1927. The princess left with her husband, an Austrian archduke, and her 6 children. Today, at age 80, she lives in the United States, where she is known as the Reverend Mother Alexandra. In 1967, she took her monastic vows and founded a monastery in rural Pennsylvania that is part of the Romanian Orthodox Church in America, and she joins us this morning from WTAE-TV in Pittsburgh. And good morning, Mother Alexandra.
Good morning. I'm delighted to speak to you.
I think the entire world, of course, was surprised to see what went on in Romania over the past week, but for you, what has it been like for you to see this uprising?
Well, for me, it was a thing of very great emotion, both of joy and relief, and also of very great sorrow.
Were you surprised? Were you surprised to see it happen at this time?
I don't know if I was surprised or not, really. In a way, I was waiting for it to happen because one saw it happening in all the other countries, and Romania seemed so terribly silent. But I always felt that there was something underneath that was going to come out, that would have to explode sometime. But that it would come in the way it did, that I did not expect, and I suppose nobody did.
And now you can see the pictures coming out of Romania today of people openly celebrating Christmas. What was that like to see those pictures?
Well, wonderful. And you know, one thing that for us seems today so strange, but they have had light for the first time on the streets. And that they rejoiced over so much. You know, they haven't had any lights in their, very little in their houses, and no lights on the streets at all, like in wartime.
You know, we think of Princess Ileana. I think that conjures up an image of kind of a fairy tale princess to many, but I was reading about your childhood in Romania, and it was very different, was it not?
Yes, it was very different. It was a very wonderful life. I think back on it with great joy and love. And it was fascinating and full of interesting work to be done. I had a lot to do with the Romanian young people, chiefly girls, but also with the boys. And so I helped to rebuild the country at that time, because after the First World War, we suddenly became from a small country a relatively large one. And we had to be all brought together, and there was a lot to be organized and done, and I threw myself into it with all my heart.
And here we are now at a time when, again, there's going to have to be great rebuilding. What do you see now for the future of Romania and what they need right now?
Well, I think that now they need to be helped from the outside. I think, unfortunately, it's a problem not only which touches Romania, but it touches all of Eastern Europe, and therefore, in fact, touches the rest of the world.
While everyone realized there was so much oppression, I know a lot of people question the execution of the leader there. What were your feelings as far as that?
Well, I'm sorry, of course, in a way, that it happened as it did. But as far as I understand, it had to be done. If they hadn't, the fighting would have become worse. They had to discourage the resistance of the security forces.
Is there any thought now that you or your nephew, King Michael, who I believe is living now in Switzerland, that either of you might go back to Romania? Would you like to go back to Romania?
That's a question which is very difficult to answer. First of all, I think it's a question that has to be settled in Romania itself, first of all. And as far as I know, what the king feels, and I think we all feel, is that it's the Romanian people who have suffered. It's the Romanian people who have to decide when they are free what they really want to do. Because certainly communism wasn't what they chose.
Yeah. Well, I know that there are elections. The elections have been called for now for April. But we thank you for joining us this morning and giving us your views. Mother Alexandra, thank you very much. We should also thank Channel 11 in Pittsburgh, WPXI, for helping us get that remote. And we'll be back. Joanna Kearns and Dan Lawyer.
We'll get another blast of Arctic air.
First, Romania, where dissident leaders have formed a new government following the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu. The new leadership won the immediate support of the United States and the Soviet Union. The execution brought an uneasy quiet to the streets of Bucharest this morning. Soldiers that have been fighting in Ceausescu's name are reportedly starting to surrender in large numbers. The ravages of battle are evident everywhere. The main palace is gutted. Buildings everywhere are damaged or destroyed. Last night, Romanian TV broadcast pictures of Ceausescu and his wife in captivity. The government says they were tried on numerous charges, including genocide. Shortly after these pictures were taken, they were executed by firing squad.
Ceausescu's execution was grimly welcome news to Romanian immigrants in the United States. For many, Ceausescu's brutal regime was the reason they fled their homeland.
Today, the terrorist Ceausescu and his wife has been executed.
At the United Nations, about 100 Romanians heard about the execution during a memorial service for those who died fighting the Ceausescu regime.
Some were disappointed that the deposed leader was not given a public trial.
He died very easily. He should have suffered like everybody else.
He destroyed people. He was maybe worse than Hitler.
Lord Jesus Christ. In Los Angeles, Romanian immigrants celebrated Christmas Mass and the emergence of a new era in their homeland. But when word of the execution spread through the congregation, there was unrestrained joy. After the service, there were tears for Romania, but not for Ceausescu.
As a Christian, I feel sorry, but he got...
Czechoslovakia. Ceausescu used the army as a labor force. Soldiers built roads, picked potatoes, dug canals. He prevented the officer corps from developing any real expertise. What they developed instead was resentment at their systematic humiliation.
As a result of the support which the army gave to the revolution in Romania, its esteem with the general populace has gone up enormously.
On the balcony from which the late leader of Romania addressed the masses, there was a changing of the guard today and a changing mood. In a vote of confidence for the military, the provisional government promoted all majors to the rank of colonel, and all colonels became generals. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
Country's name, dropping the words Socialist Republic. The army, meanwhile, declared victory. Tanks that were guarding the center of Bucharest returned to their bases today, although scattered